I have some really rad friends. I have some friends who, just because they're not famous, just because they're not what we, in this day and age, what we consider quote unquote an influencer, doesn't mean that their story is any less important or impactful. They just don't have a platform. And that's what I wanted to bring. I wanted to bring a combination of people who are maybe higher profile and people that you have never heard of and don't know, but still have a story to share and still have a voice. And I really want to just bring those stories and amplify those voices.
Disinformation is spreading.
There will be a surprise outbreak. Is the issue of pandemic.
No social distancing at all.
They said that they would express their concerns about the mask supply.
Where's the mask? Where's the glove?
A second wave is...
We all need some good news.
A message for all the healthcare workers out there.
Thank you.
If you're looking for hope tonight, raise your hand. If you feel alone and don't understand, if you're fighting the fight of your life, then stand.
From Santa Rosa, California, this is 19 Stories. I'm Cheryl Halling. My guest, Jessica Yañez, is the creator, host, and producer of the Wine and Chisme Podcast, which was created to share the stories of everyday people doing extraordinary things to serve their community. Jessica brings her love for wine and passion for storytelling together to highlight the stories that need to be told in communities of color. She's also created the first and most comprehensive list of Latine-owned wine brands based in the U.S. Her motto, we not only work the land, we own the brand. Jessica is Latina, fierce, a fighter, with a laugh as big as her hair. I'd like to welcome Jessica Yañez to 19 Stories.
Thank you so much. How are you, Cheryl?
You are welcome, and I'm doing really good. Thank you. How are you doing?
I am doing really well. If you could hear my stomach is growling because I forgot to eat something. Hence no wine today, because if I was drinking even a sip of wine with no food, I'd be like really loopy.
Yeah, that's not a good mixture for me either. But seriously, we have, for those who don't know about the platform we're recording on, there is a mute button on your end. So if you need to munch so that you don't faint while we're talking, please feel free to do so. So where are you speaking with me from, and what are your current COVID directives, if any?
I am in my home in San Diego. I live just outside of downtown. And in San Diego, we're actually doing really well. We have one of the highest vaccination rates in the state, if not the country. So I feel like a lot of people are continually wearing masks. We're not under any specific directive down here. And I think it's just what people are doing themselves. So you do still see a lot of people going into grocery stores and certain inside places with masks, myself included. But San Diego is an outside place. Well, a lot of people are outside, so you don't see it so much when people are outside walking and running and working out. But it feels pretty good here, to be perfectly honest.
About a month ago, it was a different situation. So I'm really encouraged to hear that. And I am so delighted to have you here with me, as there's so much I want to chat about. But before I do that, can you share what Chisme means and how did you come to choose that name for your podcast?
Absolutely. So Chisme is Spanish for gossip. So technically the name of the podcast is the Wine and Gossip Podcast. I'm somebody who's always loved wine, and I've always been what we would call chismosa, which I like to know all the information. I want to know everybody's business. But I was joking with some friends one day, and I said, they were asking what I was doing for my birthday, and I was going to have a wine and cheese night. And I said, I was going to have wine and cheese me. And then one of my friends was like, oh my gosh, that's brilliant. You need to change your Instagram name to that. You need to use that name. And as I was trying to figure out what the name, as I hadn't launched the podcast as of yet, and as I was thinking of names, I had a completely different name in mind. And then I was just like, why is it not Wine and Chisme? That's just who I am. And that's what I ended up going with. And I'm so happy because it really seems to resonate. People who've known me my whole life feel like it matches me because this is who I am regardless of age, right? I'm somebody who a new student would come and I would introduce myself and tell me all their story. And now I'm doing that as an adult, except now I'm recording it and drinking wine.
which can make for some really interesting conversation. And I just love the fact that your podcast presents stories from an eclectic mix of Latinx professionals, including vintners, artists, authors, entrepreneurs, to name a few, who are talking about their given profession and their love for good wine. And I'm curious what you think, or if you've faced any misconceptions that people hold when it comes to thinking about wine as it relates to Latinx in the wine business.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I want to just be clear that my podcast is not strictly a Latina podcast. It really is highlighting stories from across communities of color. So I've had people from South Asian community, Filipinos, like the Pacific community, the Black community, the the Latino community or Latina community, because I wanted it to be a reflection of who my friends were. And my friends come across all communities of color, and I didn't see that there was a podcast that brought our collective voices together. Now, when it comes to wine, and specifically Latina vintners, and in our community, many of us did not grow up with wine, myself included. I did not grow up with wine. I did not grow up knowing about wine. I think that the extent of my knowledge of wine was wine coolers. And my mom
Seagram's wine coolers. Yes, I think we all,
yes.
Or maybe you're too young to remember that.
No, I remember those. And then every once in a while, my mom would get that like Franzia boxed wine. That was my extent. But so many of us within the Latina community are unaware of what wine is. And when we think of wine, we think of something like very like high class or something that doesn't go with our food. And I got my first wine certification. And one of the things that I wanted to bring to my community and my listeners is that it is accessible and that there are these vintners that make wine for our taste buds, right? For the foods that we're eating outside of just normal things that you think like pasta and seafood and steak. You can have wine with mole and tacos and with ceviche. You can have wine with those things. And to be able to kind of give a little bit of tidbit here and there or every episode, if I can do a little bit to make people think of wine more accessibly and it not be so stodgy, that's really what my goal is, because I think it shouldn't be. There's so many really good wines out there, and they don't they're very accessible and they're very good and they pair very well with things that many of us eat in our community every day.
Well, now you definitely have me wanting a glass of wine. And thank you for explaining that. And if you could expand upon wine certification, what is that?
So there's different things that you can do to learn about wine. I'm going through the Napa Valley Wine Academy. Through the Wine Spirit Education Trust, they have different things that you can learn. I'm learning more about wine. So there's several levels within that. So I have my first level certification. I've recently applied for a scholarship so I can get my second level certification. And really what that does is that really helps kind of expand your thoughts in regards to wine and the different flavors and the different textures and the different regions and how wine can pair with food. Sometimes people will think, oh, I like this wine, and then eat something with it and be like, oh, this must be a bad wine. It may not be a bad wine. You just may not be pairing it with the right thing. So I think we had paired like a Rioja. Riojas are one of my favorite wines. And then she had us pair it with something sweet, I think. And I had like the Maria's cookies because I'm not a chocolate person. So I tried it with that and it was so gross.
Okay.
You try the wine and you're like, oh, the wine is good. Then you take a bite of the cookie and then you try the wine again and it completely changes the flavor. And you're like, oh my gosh. It's like, you know, that little emoji with the head explosion?
Yes, exactly.
That's what it is.
Exactly.
So just learning about those things, right? Learning about how different foods affect the taste of your wine and then being able to share that with other people, because you wouldn't think that, right? You're like, a lot of us think, oh no, we drink soda or iced tea or water or something and it tastes the same, but that's not the case with wine.
Yeah, it's interesting. I went to my first I live in Sonoma County, which is one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you, because I was absolutely, I'll out my ignorance. I didn't know about Latin-owned companies. Bit of the information that I was reading about you, and certainly your motto, we not only work the land, we own the brand. Because I see so many workers I have never been exposed to or known of Latina wines. It's incredible to me. And I went to one of my first official tastings, wine and food pairing. And it was amazing to even like a green bean. You're like, how can green bean change the taste of a wine? Mm-hmm. And it completely does, depending on the wine that you're drinking. And in one of your podcasts, you mentioned, is it Las Amigas Cuvée, or maybe it was one of your guests. And I was like, I love Cuvée, so I'll have to try that.
So good. You're going to love it. Apparently it tastes, and I've never had Taittinger, but apparently people compare it to Taittinger.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Definitely need to try it then. I read in your bio that 5 years ago you were living in Dallas and, to quote you, trying to figure out my next move. And you were really wrestling with, should I stay or should I go? And obviously you chose to come back to California. But I'm curious, as someone who also left California and moved to the South, came back, what prompted the move in the first place? And what was missing for you that you felt called to return home?
I spent 15 years in Dallas, and I think in my heart of hearts, I always knew that wasn't where I was going to be forever. And I think I tried to make it fit because I had really grown in my professional. I grew up in California, but I became an adult while I was in Texas. And I learned a lot about myself, and I appreciate all of that time. And I continually go back to Dallas to visit my friends and everything. But there was a few things. One, I am a water baby. I love the beach. I love the salt air. I love, that is my happy place. In fact, the very first tattoo I got is of waves. And in Spanish, it says mi paz, mi alma, which is my peace, my soul. That is just a big piece of me that was missing there because Dallas is a very landlocked area. Obviously, my family is still in California. And there was times I went 2 years one time without seeing my family because of job, because of this, because of that. And it was really difficult. My mom had gone through breast cancer the first time and I couldn't be there for her.
Oh, wow.
I came back for 2 weeks. But otherwise, I had to go back. I had to work. I had to do the things that I had to do because my life was in Dallas. And that was really difficult. And I think, like I said, ultimately, it just wasn't meant for me to be there forever. Dallas was meant to be a very significant part of my life, which it is. And I will always have a heart for Dallas. It will always be part of me. It will always be a part of home for me. But I always wanted to come back, not only just come back to California, but be back in San Diego, because this is where my heart has always been my entire life. And I love it here. And I honestly, after moving back to San Diego, I cannot imagine being anywhere else.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? When I read that, I'm thinking, knowing all that San Diego is and has to offer, and that you went to Dallas, I'm thinking, how did she do that?
I think sometimes you have to, right? I think it's good to get away from, I know people who've never moved away. I know people who've never lived outside of a 10-mile radius. And if that's what their heart calls them to do, I think that's great. I have lived in 3 other states. I've lived in New Mexico. I've lived in Arizona. I've lived in Texas and California. And I have appreciated that. Not appreciated New Mexico so much because that wasn't necessarily my choice. That was with family. But okay. I think when you have the opportunity to step away from the familiar, it's really an opportunity to grow. I would have not grown in the way that I did had I not left California.
That's a really good perspective. I'm right there with you. I think that traveling is one of the best educators you could have because it exposes you to, for all the right reasons. It takes you out of your comfort zone, exposes you to cultures and environments that you would perhaps never have the opportunity to experience. And yeah, sometimes being away from family and all that kind of forces you to grow because you don't have that to fall back on. So given that podcasting is the in thing to do right now, I think a lot of podcasts were birthed out of the pandemic. I know mine was. because people either had the time or figured if not now, when. But you and I know from a podcasting group that we're in that not everybody sticks with it. There's so many challenges and joys of podcasting, but not everybody stays with it. So I'm curious, what was it that prompted you to launch one with such a unique, fun, and important theme?
So I launched right before the pandemic. My first 3 episodes dropped February 17th of 2020, had a launch party on February 20th, 2020. And then within, a few weeks, we were in lockdown. So it was literally right before. So it wasn't prompted by the pandemic. It was right before that. But like I said previously, it was really, I would listen to podcasts and I felt like there was a silo between various communities of color. There was Latino podcasts. There was Black podcasts. There were Asian podcasts. But I never felt like there was something that brought our voices together. And collectively, and especially in the political times that we're in, for me, I was like, you know what? Our voices collectively are so much stronger than they are individually. And that was one of the reasons. But again, I wanted to also be a reflection of my friendships, of who was in my life. And the other thing that I saw was that every time I would listen to any of these podcasts, it was like the same 15 people on every single podcast.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you know what? I have some really rad friends. I have some friends who, just because they're not famous, just because they're not what we, in this day and age, what we consider quote unquote an influencer, doesn't mean that their story is any less important or impactful. They just don't have a platform. And that's what I wanted to bring. I wanted to bring a combination of people who are maybe higher profile and people that you have never heard of and don't know, but still have a story to share and still have a voice. And I really want to just bring those stories and amplify those voices.
I am definitely simpatico with you because telling people stories, and it's interesting. I didn't realize that you and I kind of have the same elevator pitch, if you will, of our podcast, in that everyday people doing extraordinary things. And people have amazing stories if they just have an outlet to tell them and share them. And I'm curious if your guests and or your audience are surprised that there is a podcast that brings together people of color in a way that, as you say, wasn't being presented before.
I think oftentimes people think it's just a community or a podcast it's another Latino podcast. That's really what oftentimes, because of the name. And then when I approach other people, because I've had people approach me and I've approached others to say, come, I'm really interested in your story. Will you come on the podcast? And they're like, oh, really? So I don't hear it much from the Latina community as much as from other communities when I ask them to come on the podcast. Because I think because of the name, they automatically think it's either a bilingual, where it's very like Spanglish, or it's, a very just Latina podcast. And I say, no, it's for people. I want to hear your story. Your story is interesting. And that, to me, that's the only way we're going to learn, right? People are so often afraid of what the unknown. So how are you supposed to know about other communities? And how are you supposed to know about other stories if they're not put in your space? And, if they're not presented to you. So if I can be, and I also want to be a safe space for people. So one of the questions that I have on my intake form is if there's anything that people don't want to talk about. And I think that instantly puts people at ease because they're like, okay, if there's something that really is triggering, I can say, I don't want to talk about, and I get this, people don't want to talk about politics. That's totally cool. Your story does not have to include politics. It does in some capacity, right? Eventually, but we don't have to talk about that. Some people are like, I don't want to talk about not necessarily their childhood, but they're like, I don't want to talk about my father or mother or whatever. And we're like, okay, not a problem. We won't talk about that. I will ask you other questions to get around that. So I just think it's really important for people to feel safe, for people to feel like they know that if they say something that people trip over their words sometimes. And this hasn't happened very often at all. But there was a couple instances where somebody just said something the wrong way and they clarified it afterwards. Like, that's not what I meant. And I was like, that's fine. Like, we'll take out that part because I understand. And the way that this cancel culture has come, right? Anything that you say can and will be held against you in the court of Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's really, really important that people know that this is a space where they can feel comfortable to share their story. So I always say, like, people are spilling the chisme, spilling the gossip on their own terms and not feeling like they're obligated to share certain things that might be triggering for them. And I don't blame them for that.
That question is something I have on my intake form as well, because making people feel comfortable and feel safe, what I have found, and it really surprised me with a recent interview, is that people will offer up things when they feel comfortable and safe that even surprise them,
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know if you found that with your guests, but I think number one, like, oh my gosh, like you say, the cancel culture, from what I understand from other podcasters, that is what is the crippling fear of, oh my gosh, I'm going to put this out there. And what if I say the wrong thing? And it actually leads me into my next question about fear. If you faced any fear in launching your podcast?
I think the biggest fear that I had was putting myself out there because
I
am an extroverted person. So anybody that knows me, I call myself an extroverted extrovert, right? Like, I'm like, hey, whatever.
Okay, you're just adding more like the extroverted extrovert.
But the thing is but I don't like attention on me. And that sounds so weird. And that sounds so counterintuitive. But let me explain what I mean by that is I am also somebody who I keep things very close to the chest, close to the vest, I think is it a thing. So I'm somebody who kind of like, you think you know me, but then when people ask like, oh, certain things, you're like, oh, I guess, yeah. Like I let people know me very superficially and things that are deeper, I don't necessarily share. And I have let more go with the podcast. I've shared a little bit more. I've done a little bit. And that was the scariest part for me because I don't like to do that. I don't like to put myself in a vulnerable position. I don't like to do those things. So that was one of the scariest things. And then when everything was happening after George Floyd and with Black Lives Matter and everything else, I was seeing so many people like calling people out for performative activism and for everything. And for a quick moment, and I'm going to explain what I mean for a quick moment, I was like, oh my gosh, what if somebody says something about me? Like, what have I done? And then I stopped myself and said, you know what? If anybody were to say, I don't think there's I don't know, right? Like, I'm sure, thank goodness social media wasn't a thing when we were kids.
Oh, amen on that. Absolutely.
Because we've all said stupid things. I can't remember anything, right? But I'm like, what if somebody called me out for performative activism or something like that? And I said, and then I stopped myself and I said, you know what? My friends would speak for me because they know my heart. They know that I'm an authentic person. And this space was created for across communities of color before George Floyd, before these things. I wanted this space to be for all of us. So I think instantly, just because people come after people so hard for anything, I think that was a smidge for a moment. Like I said, literally a moment that I had that. And I was like, wait, you know what? I've been doing this work for a long time. I've been having these uncomfortable conversations with my friends for a long time. I've been trying to figure out what is the best, how am I going to improve myself as a human for years. So that moment passed and I haven't thought about it again, to be perfectly honest, unless I'm like talking about it in a situation like this. But now I don't think there's anything that, maybe now the only thing that scares me is, and this sounds really stupid too, is like it blowing up and having incredible success. That's a little bit scary.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. And because, be careful what you ask for because you just might get it. And just in the short time, this is the most conversation you and I have had really, because when we're in this other networking group, it really is about educating everyone on a particular topic or bringing things before the group that we're struggling with or need advice on. But I have seen you grow so fast. I mean, in the sense that your branding is on point, if you will. You've come up with merchandising, and I'd love for you to talk about your wine and cheese tastings. And for those who have never heard your podcast, and hopefully they will all go and listen to it after this, but what exactly do you do on your podcast from the time a guest comes on?
So the awesome thing of having a name like the Wine and Chisme is the one constant is I drink wine with every episode. But the cool thing is that I'm not relegated to talk to about any particular topic. We can talk about anything. Okay. And I absolutely love that because it allows me to talk about politics. It allows me to talk about Black Lives Matter. It allows me to talk about sex and dating, about, somebody's journey into social media stardom. It allows me to talk about everything. And for me, that has been so freeing because it's really, truly like having just a sit down conversation with somebody, because I am somebody who's naturally so curious. I want to know all of these things. And so one of the things that I really like to do, I think it's so important to hear people's origin stories, right? I think so often when we are talking to people about their successes, we're so focused on the success that we forget about the stumbles.
Yes.
And what it took to get there. So to me, it's always really interesting to hear, like, what did your parents expect from you versus what you expect from you? I think sometimes, especially within communities of color, we tend to take on our parents' expectations, but then at some point we realize that's not really what our expectation for our life and ourselves are. So I like to ask those types of questions. I want to find out, like, what has been your biggest, like, in your success now, what has been your biggest challenge, and what has been your bliss? What has given you those blissful moments, and everything in between? So I like to ask kind of all the questions. Like I said, like you're just sitting down with a friend and tell me everything. I want to know everything. And that has just, and people, like you said, when they feel comfortable and they feel safe, they are willing to share a lot more with you. And being authentic, I think, is so important. People know when somebody's not being authentic.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You might be able to get away with it for a quick minute, but literally the person that I am on the podcast, the person I am, like, this is who I am. I will chat your ear off and I will ask you a million questions, right? Like, this is who I am. I want to know everything about you. And like I said before, it's just now I get to record it and drink wine while I do it. But it's something that I've done since I was like in elementary school.
It's kind of like almost a happy hour, because you say things in happy hour and talk about things that maybe you normally wouldn't. And I would imagine with you being, more open and vulnerable, it gives, again, the open door and permission, if you will, for your guests to do the same. And you just set up my next set of questions so perfectly. So thank you. I'm just going to thank you in advance. That if you had to pick one of your greatest achievements, professionally or otherwise, what would it be?
Ooh, God, that's such a hard question because there's so many moments, right, that I'm really proud of. I'm proud of the decision that I made to move to Texas by myself at 20, the first time I went, because I went, came back and went. So I spent a total of 15 years there. At 21, just short of my 22nd birthday, drove by myself. I'm really proud of that decision.
Yeah, that's huge.
Oh my gosh. When you're young, you're fearless.
Yes.
Right? You're like, yeah, I'll do it. I can do anything. And then as you get older, like that fear creeps in. Mm-hmm. And, I'm proud of working with the Super Bowl. I worked with the North Texas Super Bowl host committee for Super Bowl 45. And I'm really proud of the friendships that I made and the work that I got to do there. I am really proud of going back to school. And even though I was 37 years old when I graduated college, but I am proud that I made that decision to go back because that's something that nobody can ever take away from me. And that's something that I wanted for me and not anybody else.
Yeah, very cool.
I'm proud that I decided to make the decision. And it wasn't an easy decision. You would think as much as I wanted to come back to California, it was an easy decision to come back, but it wasn't. I was very comfortable in Texas. I was very comfortable in Dallas. and knowing that I was going to have to come back and stay with my parents and find a job and figure out the next step of my life was very scary. And I'm proud that I took that step. And I'm proud that I was able to move back to San Diego and start my life again. And I am proud of the fact that I took the risk to start the Wine and Chisme podcast, because for the first time in my life, it felt like I was doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Isn't that beautiful? I love that. Fantastic answers. And I'm curious then if there's a less than successful time that informed you of the next right step to take.
Oh my gosh. How long do you have? Absolutely. I have stumbled and fell so many times, and I continue to do so. But I think the key is to try and fall forward, right?
Yeah.
And what I mean by saying falling forward, Guy, I feel like I'm just like, all these things are coming to my head. I feel like I sound so smart.
You are, my dear. You are. You have that's why we're talking. And that's what's the coolest thing about having a conversation in a podcast is that things come up that maybe you wouldn't have thought of or haven't thought of for a long time. So
yes,
talk away.
I'm just like, wow, listen to me. I sound good.
You do sound good.
So what I mean like by falling forward is I tend to have a positive mindset. I tend to have a see the silver lining types of attitude. But it's not always easy, and it's not all the time. So when those downs would come, right? There's many hills, there's many peaks, and there's many valleys. And when it's time for the valleys, it's like, okay, it's okay to mourn the loss of a job, the loss of a person, the loss of a loved one, whether, anything. But when I say fall forward is not getting stuck in that moment. Because so often when something bad happens to us or in our lives, it's so easy to get stuck in that hole and feel sorry for ourselves. And I've done it. And I've done it, and it was an ugly time, and it took a long time to get out of there. And once I did, I was like, I'm not going to allow myself not to be in a hole again, but not to stay in the hole, right? And not see the sunlight. And if we see the opportunity that we have, because there's always an opportunity in there, we always have choice. And we may not like the choices that we have, but we always have a choice. And I hate when people say, I don't have a choice. Yes, you do. You have a choice. You may not like the choices that you have, but you do have a choice. So what are you going to do with those choices? Because one of, those choices will help you make the next choice. And that'll give you more and more and more until you are dug out of that hole and you're moving forward. So that's what I mean when I say like falling forward. You can't stay in paralysis analysis, right? Where you're just not doing anything, because where is that going to get you? So I'm always of the mindset of, I can do this. Like if I stay in this really funky mood or whatever, what is that doing for me? It's doing nothing. And everybody has their own circumstances. So I am not like trying to minimize anybody's circumstances by any means. I've gone through a lot of crazy stuff as well. But I'm just saying, like, we all have a choice, and we have to, in order to move forward, in order to fall forward, we have to make it. And each choice will give you more choices, and each choice will give you more choices. And you have to continue to do that until you finally see where the light is and where the path is leading you. And that's what I have done. I've lost jobs. There's been times where I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to pay my electricity bill. I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent. And then something last minute happens. And I'm somebody, I have faith. I do believe in God, and God has always come through for me. And it may not be in my timing, like, recently.
It rarely is.
Oh my gosh, never, right? You're just like, really, come on, I'm waiting. But for example, like my 9-to-5 job, that just recently ended because the client decided to no longer continue. And that was my job, was to handle this client. And I'm like, okay, well, I have enough for, I don't have a ton of money saved up, but okay, I can pay rent. And that's my focus right now. Paying minimums, I can pay rent. And that's my focus. And looking for a job, and it's going to be okay. I could have easily got stuck in, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. They didn't officially give me an end date, blah, blah, blah. But what would that have done for me? Like, truthfully, that wouldn't have done anything. That wouldn't have made looking for a job easier. It wouldn't have made looking at my finances easier. It wouldn't have made any of that easier. And then, I'm not even kidding, a couple of days ago, my boss sent me another check.
I love that.
Totally unexpected. And I was just like, you got me, God. You got me. You always got me back.
I so love stories like that because you talk about choices. First of all, if you don't make a choice, that's a choice.
Right.
Because maybe things unfold that are really less than desirable had you made a choice that we think would be the best one for the moment, but it's a choice. And you mentioned your faith. One of my questions was going to be is if you have a particular faith or a set of tools that you rely on when you're fearful. And I am just right there with you. There's a great book called Just Enough Light for the Step I'm On. And it talks about just take the next step, take the next step. And every time you take that step, the light will appear for you to take the next step and trusting.
Totally. And I'm not somebody who, I will be very transparent. I have not found a church home at all anymore. I had a very traumatic experience with the previous megachurch in Dallas. I believe in God. I don't necessarily believe in the church right now. So I'm going to be very transparent in regards to that. I believe in God. I believe in the universe. I believe in that. And I think there's a lot of people that are like that have had kind of PTSD from a church. I'm one, and that's where I fall in. But I still have faith in God.
Well, that's the most important thing, Jessica. I mean, the church is made up of imperfect people who are going to hurt you in their way to try and figure things out. And certainly the past 18 months with the pandemic and, certain churches operating in such a way that, let's just say I concur with you and I absolutely understand what you're saying. So I appreciate you talking about that. But I think our faith and our belief is the most important thing because you can have your devotion and your relationship wherever you go. That's what's so wonderful about it. So I would love to chat for a moment about your list of Latine-owned wine brands, because when I went on your website and checked that out, again, I was like, I was like, why are we not exposed as consumers? Like you say, with your podcast, it's made up of all nationalities of color that you're bringing together to educate and inform and talk to and have difficult discussions. But I live in wine country, and that was, looking at that list, that was an education for me.
Yeah. Even within our own community, we didn't know. So when I started the podcast and I was going to Trader Joe's and Target and whatnot to find wine, and there was a point I was like, there has to be Latino-owned winemakers. I know there has to be. And so I just started doing research, and the research led me to the Mexican American Vintners Association, which is based out of Napa. And I reached out to them, and I hadn't heard anything for a while. But then I started looking, and I would find all of these articles about Latina winemakers, or not winemakers. So let me just be clear. There are winemakers and brand owners. So the brands that are on the directory are U.S.-based wine brand owners, Latina owners. They are the owners of the wine brand. There are many winemakers that are, from the Latina community, but they don't own the brand. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you.
I kept seeing the same 10 to 15 names on these lists. And I was like, there has to be more. There has to be more. So I just kept doing digging. And then I was going on social media and trying to find them. And then I would find one and they'd be like, oh, you should know about this one too. And everybody's very gracious and wonderful in regards to referring other Latina-owned wine brands. And when I ask people, I'm like, did you guys know that there's Latina-owned wine brands? 9 out of 10 people within that I talked to within our own community had no idea. And that's when I knew that there was a void that needed to be filled. And if nobody was going to do it, I was going to do it. And that's what I did. Then I just started collecting names and started reaching out. And, I initially had just this very long list. And I had a friend who was helping me, and he said, yeah, let's do this. Let's create an actual directory. And he helped blow up my vision. And now it's here. And I'm so proud and so excited that it is.
What an amazing resource. And I would imagine that the brand owners are equally excited to have an outlet to be exposed not only to your audience, but beyond, and put them on the map, so to speak. Like I said, I live in Sonoma County. I had no idea. And that was an education for me. So you saw a need and you fulfilled it. Yeah. And isn't it interesting that it took this long?
I was floored, to be perfectly honest, that something like this didn't already exist. And I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked. And the other reason I know nothing else existed is because these vintners have reached out to me and said, thank you for doing this. Nobody's ever done this.
Yeah, I would imagine that would create a really wonderful relationship that you can move forward and have events and tie in with maybe some promotion and get your podcast and your message out there, just like you're getting theirs out. And I'm curious, Jessica, what makes you hopeful during this time?
God, just generally in life?
Yeah.
I know that we see a lot of the negative things that happen in this world. But what makes me hopeful is anytime when I'm scrolling through TikTok or Instagram or anything like that, what makes me hopeful is seeing something kind happening between strangers. What makes me hopeful is the laugh of my nephews and my nieces, to see them smile and to hear their joy. And what makes me hopeful is knowing that people are being educated and trying to open up their mind and trying to be better humans. And I think I'm just ultimately, I'm a hopeful person. I try and see the good in people, and I think there's more good than bad. Unfortunately, we see more of the bad, but I'm hopeful that people want to see more of the good and ultimately want to be the good. And that gives me hope.
I would imagine that ties in, you mentioned joy of watching your nieces and nephews. Is that what also brings you joy? Is
wine. Wine brings me joy.
Of course it does.
I would be amiss to say that. I could not say that. What brings me joy ultimately is my family and my friends, my faith. Sitting at the beach brings me joy. It brings me calm. It brings me peace. Obviously, my nieces. I mean, number one are my nieces and nephews. I would literally lay down my life for them. And just when they want to do stuff with me, that gives me so much joy, right? Like, I'm somebody who likes to do experiences with especially my nephews, because they're getting older too. So the last time they visited me, I only had them for 2 days, but we made the most of those 2 days. Like, we went and had a bonfire, and the next day went to the beach, and then we went to the Padres game. Oh my gosh, we went to the Padres-Dodgers game, 16 innings, and we stayed for the whole thing.
16 innings?
16 innings. They wanted to stay for the whole thing. I would have gone home, but the only reason I stayed was because of them. And then I'm close enough to walk to the stadium, but it's like 2:00 in the morning. We can't walk back. And we're on scooters, and they were just like loving life, having so much fun riding these scooters back to my place. And my youngest nephew who's with me, he's behind me, he's holding on to me. And he's like, oh my gosh, Thea J, this is so much fun. Oh my gosh, that just made my whole night, So doing stuff like that with my nephews in particular, like I said, because they're boys and they're they're between the ages of 9 and 17. But the fact that they still want to do stuff with me makes me like the happiest person ever.
Very, very cool. And those are memories you can't buy. I mean, the fact that 16 innings held anybody's attention, let alone children, if you will, is really remarkable, actually.
Oh my gosh, we had a good time, but I was exhausted. I was trying to convince them. You guys want to leave? No, we want to stay. Oh, okay.
I hadn't planned on asking you this, but it certainly makes sense. Do you have a particular type of wine that you prefer over others?
I tend to lean towards reds. there are some really fabulous whites that I have been trying lately. God, it's so hard. It's like, there's just so many really, really good wines. I love cabs, but if I'm not want something so heavy and so tannic and so dry, I'll usually lean towards a Beaujolais or a Pinot Noir. Those are lighter on the lighter side.
Yeah.
I love Riojas. I'm super excited for the next wine tasting that we're doing. We're going to get a Tempranillo from Oregon, so I'm super excited about that. Zinfandels are so good. Not to be confused with white Zinfandel. Zinfandel is a red wine.
I understand that one. I did understand that one. Yes.
But yeah, there's so many good ones out there. It's so hard to pick. I mean, it just, again, it depends on what you're eating, your mood, you're like all of these things, right? But it's definitely, there's so many wonderful wines out there. So it's hard to pick one.
If there was a soundtrack to your life, what would be on it and why?
Oh my gosh. Well, let me tell you, the soundtrack to my life would be very eclectic, just like my Apple Music collection is, because that's just who I am. I think I would have a little bit of Spanish rock. It'd have a little bit of Celia Cruz. It would have a little bit of Motown. It would have a little bit of like 80s freestyle, pop. It would just kind of it's just an eclectic thing because that's what I love. And the reason I say that is because ultimately I want to be a citizen of the world. And what I mean by that is I want to travel and I want to learn about other communities and other cultures. And I think that's how we understand each other, is becoming, like I said earlier, we're so afraid of the unknown. But let's know it. Let's expose ourselves to it. Let's learn about it so we're not afraid of it and become true citizens, true global citizens. And that's why I think the soundtrack to my life would be just as eclectic.
That's beautiful. And I think you'll appreciate this. I saw Celia Cruz at the Universal Amphitheater years and years and years ago. But the rule at this particular amphitheater, because they had gone from an outdoor venue to an indoor one, they put a roof over it, is you couldn't get up and dance. You don't book Celia Cruz and thank you. That's why I'm telling you, because you would probably appreciate that, because no one's ever said her. And I'm thinking, you don't book Celia Cruz and tell people they can't dance. And so these poor ushers were running around trying to get people to sit down, and then it was a lost cause. It was like, okay, just give up the ghost.
Absolutely. You do not tell Latinos they can't dance to Celia Cruz or Hector Lavoe or Banda, any of that. Like, no, I don't think so. That's not going to happen. That's crazy. How can you not? I'm at home. That's what I like. I put on a Celia Cruz station when I'm cleaning because I'm like, yes, let's move. Let's move our hips and clean and dance and I can't even clean my house and not have that. That's crazy.
That is so funny. I have this visual of you now. So thank you for sharing. How can people get a hold of you?
There's a few ways. My social media on Instagram is at The Wine and Chisme. Make sure to put the in there. My Facebook is The Wine and Chisme Podcast. And you can go to my website, thewineandchismepodcast.com.
And there you go. And I will definitely have it in the show notes as well. Jessica, it has been a pleasure. The only thing that I'm missing is the fact that we're not having some wine, and we're both on Pacific Standard Time. It's like 4 p.m. Although it's happy hour somewhere, right?
And you know what? It literally just started pouring here in San Diego.
Oh, please send some of that up here. Please. We so
randomly. I was just like, I could hear the thunder and I look outside and it's just pouring rain. So it's dark. Technically it's dark. It's not even 4:00, but it looks like wine weather outside to me.
Well, it is Friday. It is a Friday. It's raining. I would say it's wine weather.
I agree. I'm going to have some soup and I'm going to have some wine. See, you wouldn't know that they would go together.
It's just you have to have the right pairing, and you are certainly one to know what that pairing would be. And Jessica Yañez, thank you so much for sharing a bit of yourself and who you are and what drives you in your passion and a bit of your history and all the good things. And I just wish you continued success with your podcast. And you know what? I'm going to just wish that and hope for you that this becomes ridiculously successful. And if you're going to deal with any fear in your life, why not deal with the fear of success?
Thank you so much, Cheryl. That's so sweet.
You're very welcome. And I'm sure we're going to stay in touch because we are on this podcasting journey, and hopefully we'll be around for as long as our listeners want to hear, and we have stories to tell and wine to pour.
Thank you so much. I just want to make sure I say thank you so much for holding this space and allowing me to share my story with you. And I want nothing but success for both of us.
Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate it. I'd also like to thank the following news outlets for the use of their clips in so aptly painting the picture of the fear that we're facing during this pandemic. BBC, PBS, Now This, UNESCO, and Some Good News. I especially want to thank Joel and Luke Smallbone, otherwise known as the Group for King and Country, for allowing me to use an excerpt of their song Together, which could not be a more hopeful and inspiring song for such a time as this. Finally, I'll leave you with the following from Proverbs 23:18. Surely there is a future, and your hope will not be cut off. Thank you again for joining me today. Feel free to offer feedback or a story idea at 19stories@soundsatchelstudios.com. Visit my website at soundsatchelstudios.com, via Instagram at CherylHollingVO. I look forward to sharing more stories on the next episode of 19 Stories From Fear to Hope. Until then, stay healthy and hopeful.
Together with our differences, together we are bolder, braver, stronger.